Good evening, ladies and gentlemen. Welcome to Arena Stage. Thanks so much for being here. How are you all doing this evening? Good, good. My name is Seema Sueko, and I serve as the Deputy Artistic Director here at Arena Stage. I'm curious, how many of you, well, first of all, how many of you have been to Arena Stage before? Great. How many of you just saw Anything Goes? Okay. And how many of you have come to one of our civil dialogues before? Oh, this is terrific. So some of you have heard our little intro previously, but for those who are new, I just thought I'd contextualize a little bit about why we're doing these civil dialogues. About a year ago, Amitai Etzioni, the wonderful gentleman to my left, approached us, and he was feeling perhaps how you might have been feeling, that we in our country seem to have lost the art of being able to have a civil dialogue with people with who might have different perspectives from ourselves. And he was curious whether we could create a structure to very intentionally rebuild the ability to have conversation. So we started doing these dialogues. This is now, is it the sixth with this one? And thank you so much for taking your evening to engage in a civil dialogue. And since the whole point of it is about conversation, it's about speaking, sharing your truth, and then listening and hearing someone else's truth, I'd like to just take about a minute of your time before I turn it over to our panelists for you to each turn to someone you did not come here with and just share why you came. 30 seconds, and the other person listens, and then reciprocate in the other direction. So, all yours. Why did you? Right. Yes, because Amitai asked. That's a good reason. Great. It looks like you all had a chance to share a little bit and hopefully listen a little bit. So one little reminder, which is if you have a cell phone or any other noise-making device, if you could put it to silent for the duration, we'd appreciate that. And I turned it now over to Professor Amitai Etzioni. Thank you.
That's right. Yeah, thank you, Seema. Thank you very much. It indeed has been a very productive collaboration with Arena Stage. And we had several, I believe, truly good conversations, and all, without exception, very civil one. We had one recently between people who supported President Trump and people who opposed him, a session called "There Are No Deplorables Here." You can see all our previous conversations on tapes, which are on Arena Stage archives. And I'm sure we're going to have an equally civil conversation tonight. Just to be absolutely sure it was civil, we're in a theater, there are trapdoors under everybody. And what I did not tell the panel before, where they end up if the trapdoors open. And this is a Chinese re-education camp. So I'm confident you're going to do well. In order to give the conversation a little structure, I'm just going to ask two sets of questions, but to be serious, these are accomplished scholars and activists and public intellectuals. They don't really need my guidance, but two things maybe can get us started. One is the question, we shouldn't really take the term being great for granted. The notion that the nation is great, at least is open to the interpretation that somehow we are superior, that we are better than others. If everybody's great, then nobody's great, right? So the only way you can be great if somebody ain't so great. And that leads to all kind of possibly chauvinistic and aggressive behavior. So one part of the question is maybe it should be just be a normal nation without any claim of greatness. But if we are going to be great, then the question is, what does make us unique? What makes us exceptional? I should just remind that one of the first people to use that term about the United States was Alexis de Tocqueville. So frankly, he had a fairly odd notion what makes American exceptional. And he had the notion that we are very good at commerce, and we're not too much bothered by art, science, and culture because we are all so hardworking. He thought that was wonderful. I'm not sure all of us feel exactly that way. And then, of course, President Reagan came up with this notion of shining hill, the shining city upon the hill. So with that, I'll turn over to my colleagues here. We have the tradition of not introducing people because your bio is in the printed program. So would you please take us from here?
Well, thank you, Amitai. And so anyway, I was just going to say thank you to Amitai and Arena Stage for hosting this important conversation. I guess maybe my first thing, I maybe contest a little bit with you, Amitai, that I think we can strive to be our best and to fulfill our ideals without necessarily suggesting that other countries can't. I think there's room at the top. I think we should all, in every nation, and expect every nation to aspire to a set of fundamental values, including basic human rights and liberties. And I like to think that one of our great founding documents, the Constitution, and I work at a place called the American Constitution Society, so it's obvious that we embrace that document. But in the preamble it says, we the people, in order to form a more perfect union. It doesn't mean we're there, but we're trying. And I think it is the process that is so valuable. The fact that we are striving to make our country a better place. I think that does not suggest that we don't think other countries can't also aspire to fulfill these same ideals. In fact, and I know we're going to get to this question later, but I actually think it is to form a more perfect union. We want other countries to also be striving to fulfill those fundamental values and to protect human rights around the globe. It makes it more possible for us to actually have a more perfect union.
But to give us a sense, because you said you want them to fulfill the same values?
Well, I think the respect for fundamental human rights is
these
universal.
these are not
should
American,
be universal.
But these are not American values.
I think they're both.
Okay, all right.
American values and universal values. I think I think the Constitution and those values of the Enlightenment are ones that are universal.
Thanks. I agree with pretty much everything you've said, but I think that there are people who will listen to that and continue along the lines that Amitai just produced. And they'll say, well, we're not Americans, folks abroad, and yet we feel like we're very deeply invested in what the United States does and how it does it and why it does it and the decisions it makes and the ways in which it frames choices. And the reason for that is power. We are a very powerful country, in addition to being one based on the ideals that I think you did a superb job of articulating. And I don't think we can run away from that. I think that to try to do that would be in a way to project a kind of false humility onto America and not act in accordance actually with our responsibilities as a very powerful country. So I guess, in the end it all comes back to Aristotle. You should be as proud as you should be of what you are. And in this case, since it's the United States of America, this pride has as well not only a backward-looking sense to the achievements that we have made, for example, being, I think, an exemplary country in the protection of freedom and liberty, and also a country that has helped others to expand their own freedom and liberty, but also an aspirational aspect, which is to say, and this goes directly, I think, to Carolyn's points, we have a sense that we can do better. And it's a good thing we've had that sense. Because if you go back to the time of the Constitution and you say, how would that map onto our society today, we would immediately notice all the injustices that would be perpetrated. And I don't have to give you a list, but think about it. And yet, somehow, that document and the spirit behind it contained the seeds of its own improvement. And it wasn't always easy, and it wasn't always peaceful, God knows the Civil War. But it's still something that kept us together, and I think it still does keep us together.
Before I ask Tony to proceed, I should say, some of you may know James Fallow. Fallow was going to join us, and he's really a man of his word. So it turns out he had a commitment on Sunday in California and on Monday, but he was still willing to fly in tonight, come us, and fly back to California on the red eye because he did not want to welch on his commitment. So I told him that we'll forgive him if he comes some other time. And Tony Appelbaum generously agreed to step in, so thank you especially for that.
Of course. I think the question, what is so great about greatness, the simplest answer is that it has it all over mediocrity. But I'll go back to the man Reagan was invoking, the moment he was invoking the shining city upon a hill. The colonists who come over to the Massachusetts Bay Colony, they have come over on a purposeful mission to create a model society, a perfected, godly society, the one right way to run a society. And they're going to do it here in Massachusetts Bay, and then Europe will take notice and move its own societies in line with the model. And they get here, and they start in, and the English Civil War hits, and everybody forgets they exist. And they spent the next 100, 200 years struggling through. All of a sudden, the world isn't paying attention to their errand into the wilderness anymore. They're not anybody's model. They're a colonial backwater. And it's in those couple hundred years, as Americans struggle with an imperfect society, where they go through controversies and schisms, they struggle with injustice and slavery and war, that America reconceives of its mission. And rather than having the single perfected godly society, we move toward trying to become a more perfect union, one which continually struggles with its imperfections. And ironically, it's in the abandonment of that sense that there is one correct model that the United States will, or that Massachusetts Bay will exemplify, and the rest of the world will pay attention. It's in that abandonment of the project that the rest of the world actually starts to pay attention. Long before American power rises, American ideas start to travel back across the Atlantic. One of the founders of my magazine distilled the American creed into what he said was the schoolyard proclamation, "I'm as good as you be." I love that Emerson sort of distills it that way, and I think of that as an American creed and a universal creed and a bold claim, and it is that claim I would suggest which is the seed of greatness.
I think I misunderstood the nature of the exercise. I received an email that said that I should prepare remarks to the question, what makes America great? So I did. I apologize in advance for the lack of spontaneity in evidence by reading these remarks. And I also apologize for their dyspeptic nature. In this era of unprecedented synergy between perception, cognition, technology, and finance, we are more and more beholden as individuals, as societies, to the vapid sloganeering that masquerades now as political rhetoric, now as impassioned argument. Propositions about America's greatness abound, whether that greatness lies in its energetic polyglot diversity or its total commitment to the animal spirits of the entrepreneurial process. Some say we're great when we resemble the nation of our past that used to make things and put people to work. Some look to the future, to an America in which we can all truly and finally do as we reasonably please, whether that's making as much money as we want or using whatever bathroom we want. I am not interested in American greatness, in large part because the last 50 years have seen the rise of transnational power that renders discussion of national greatness, American or otherwise, quaint at best. Transnational power, by which I mean that still proliferating body of entities and interests whose innovations and practices define the true political order of our time. Sometimes people refer to this power as capitalism or the corporate state, both terms which belie, I believe, the complexity of the system now giving shape to and reaping benefit from most human lives today. Indeed, the system is mature, as evidenced by the devices it has given us, not only capable of rerouting our thoughts, but monetizing the very process of consciousness itself. In response to the increasingly exhaustive reach of this unspoken totalitarian regime, the rise of contemporary authoritarianism is a perfectly logical consequence. The demos, or the people, have long been disillusioned by the so-called democratic process, a process that sings its own praises endlessly, yet remains entirely ineffective at offering any meaningful check against this transnational economic cancer. Justifiably disillusioned with democracy, the demos yearns, not irrationally for a savior, but rationally for an effective point of purchase, whatever it may be, against the spreading of this desperate and fatal affliction. The canniest and crudest of our political actors recognize the legitimacy of this, the people's desire, and respond to it, however, cynically, while the most measured, nuanced, and admired of our leaders seem to have no clue what is really being asked for, and offer instead the promise of useless moral triumph, further individual franchise, the righting of admittedly grievous historical wrongs, and the celebration of identity. The burdens we face as a civilization are manifold and dire. I don't need to explain that to anybody in this room. I won't burden you all with my personal laundry list. For expediency's sake, let's just take one: the world's aquifers. They're drying out. By 2050, almost 2 billion people will no longer have access to groundwater, clean or otherwise. The attendant destabilizing global migrations will pulverize the infrastructure and very notion of the nation state. The transnational regime, however, is already well situated to make proverbial hay from the resulting chaos. Our situation is grim and the prognosis is bleak. It is in that grave spirit, and without intending any disrespect to this esteemed panel, that I decline to offer any comment on American greatness.
Well, that's very much appreciated. No, you did well. You gave a lot of material for the next round, and I'm just going to add a little to it so we continue the conversation. So let's talk about the question: who appointed the United States to give the world a liberal order, and how much should we invest in home? The way Michael Mandelbaum would argue that the best way for us to lead is making our society better, or by bringing rights and democracy to other nations. But to make it a little more specific, I'd like to use one example, and that is something I don't think everybody in this room is completely familiar with. That is something called freedom of navigation assertion. That is that the United States, especially the Pentagon, is taking the position that the United States is in charge of securing free navigation on the 7 seas of the world, on any place in the world. And if any country, it doesn't matter friend or foe, including, for instance, Canada and Chile, puts any limitations on the freedom of navigation, the United States will send its warships to violate those arrangements and publicize the fact that you said, for instance, you would like to be notified before a ship with nuclear weapons comes through our borders. The United States says that is violation of freedom of navigation. It will send some ships with nuclear weapons and advertise the fact, just to establish the norm is there are no limits on freedom of navigation. That issue arises now practically every day with China. Now, here's 2 ways of looking at that. One is freedom of navigation is indeed a wonderful good. It allows commerce, it allows freedom of movement of people. It's a public good. Why shouldn't a country, a powerful country, support it? On the other hand, you can ask, who appointed the United States to be in charge of bringing order to the world, and for it to judge when a limitation is legitimate or not. So maybe when we do the other round, but those of us who are not yet transnational, as we can warm our way up that way, maybe we look at that example and at the other one, the much bigger one. Should we, is it our duty, it is our place to bring our understanding of democracy and rights to other nations? At one point you said, well, these are universal values. Well, the Germans think that social and economic rights are part of the Universal Declarations. That's not the American view. So even on rights, I think there are different interpretations.
That depends. I think some Americans think that. Well, so I think Ayad raised some very interesting points that are directly relevant to this conversation, because the first thing that I started to think about was about climate change, and about the drying up of aquifers, and about the impact on people who are desperate for water, who are now moving, who are looking for a better life for their families, who are seeking to avoid starvation, and they are becoming refugees. There is civil war across large swaths of obviously in Syria, but it's spilling over, and so many people are affected by the issues that are raised by failing to address this catastrophic environmental issue. Those are the kinds of questions that cannot be solved by one nation. And I think the United States is unfortunately not as much of a part of it as it should be. But we have to be an instrument with other countries, and there are so many others that are recognizing, whether it's self-interest or whether it's humanitarian because of the impact that it's having on so many people. That is the kind of issue that has to be resolved through unified efforts of many nations. And so, I think your example about the issue of navigation is one where, it seems these are also questions that need multilateral responses rather than dictatorial approaches. But I think without that kind of recognition that we cannot impose one answer, but we also are suffering the consequences if we don't join in these multilateral approaches to address what I think is so clearly the most significant issue facing our planet for the foreseeable future.
Should we be in Afghanistan and Iraq promoting democracy?
I don't really see that we are promoting democracy in Afghanistan and Iraq.
Should we?
Well, I think there are many questions that go into resolving that, and I think each one is going to be specific. I think as a general matter, there are times when it makes sense for the United States to be part, again, of a general effort to create better standards for humans to live in, and that this is particularly the case when you have these humanitarian crises like in the civil war in Syria, where we see the flow of refugees and the impact that it's having across Europe and on the political systems there. So it's a very difficult question that you raise, because I have, let's say, I want to have, not to say there's a general answer to any of these things. They do involve American interests, as well as thinking about how we can advance our ideals. Sometimes it's not possible in a way that is going to either advance democratic principles or advance American interest. I think it's an ongoing dialogue, and there's not a simple answer.
I teach a class at Georgetown in the master's program in the School of Foreign Service.
Can you put the mic to the
Yeah, sorry.
No.
I teach a class in ethics and decision making in the master's program at the School of Foreign Service at Georgetown. And I have wonderful students. They tend not to come directly out of college, but rather they've been around. This one's been in a NGO in Afghanistan, and that one was taught English in China, and the other one was in the military. So it's a really interesting cross section. But when they start this class, I've noticed that they have there's a general tendency, and that is that they're in favor of good things and they're against bad things. And the purpose of the class, I guess I would say, is to broaden their understanding in order to see that some good things do come along with bad things, and some bad things have good things underlying them. And in any case, as Parmenides might say or not, the good is not one. It's a complicated matter. Maybe all the pieces fit together in some sort of universal theological scheme or something, but for us in this world dealing with the issues that we have, it doesn't work that way. So I think you can take one or two basic postures toward this situation. One is to adopt a critical posture. This is a view that says my purpose here is to understand the world as it is and to speak the truth about the world. And that's it. And I think we got that a little from Ayad. I think that might be, certainly, you'll characterize your...
You are welcome. This is civil dialogue. You're welcome to do anything you want civilly. And that's an important perspective, because I think it gives you it pulls back from the moment, from the immediate circumstances in which we find ourselves, the direct political questions from which we're confronted. It raises more basic and more fundamental questions. The other perspective, I think, though, is very much more of a policy-oriented perspective, and I don't know, frankly, that's where I situate myself. One of the things I've been doing over the past 15 years is trying to figure out ways that our government and working with our allies, that we can get better at identifying places where people are at grave risk for their lives, a kind of early warning with regard to atrocities and conflict, to see if we can then identify these places, to think about strategies that might help to mitigate these kinds of problems, et cetera. And I think that's a worthwhile endeavor too. But they are they're different kinds of ways of approaching these kinds of problems. I don't have the answer to Amitai's question is it sort of depends on where where you look at it from. And nobody made us policemen. The United States became the enforcer of this sort of freedom of navigation by more or less a handoff from the Brits, and that wasn't any kind of a sociable handoff. That was about a power in decline, namely Great Britain, and it was about a power on the rise, namely the United States. And the rarity, the interesting thing about this is that this was actually rather peaceable handoff of power, which is not the norm when one power is declining and another power is rising. So when we think about these kinds of things, I think if you're dealing with it at the policy level, you're really just asking the question, how can we get through this? How can we make this better? If people have problems with some of our freedom of navigation exercises, they will voice them. But I think the fundamental principle in that particular case is one to which nations have in principle agreed, and somebody's got to do it, and we do it.
No, I'm sorry. I don't want to go home feeling I'm a complete failure as a moderator. It's 100 years now since President Wilson felt we're going to bring to the world democracy and human rights, or at least democracy. Since then, there has been a major aspiration of various presidents, and we sent often our military to get us there. We won the war in Afghanistan in 3 weeks, but we stayed there with $500 billion and endless lives lost because we wanted to turn them into a Switzerland. We discovered very quickly there were no nuclear weapons in Iraq, and we stayed there to rebuild everything in the American image. It has been our aspiration, our legitimacy, that we are going to bring democracy, if necessary, at the point of a bayonet. So even for our friend Francis Fukuyama, when he talked about the march of history, that we are all nations naturally going to become American. He said some nations are stuck in history and we have to give them a little shove. Do we need to give nations a shove?
I'm going to answer your Iraq question. And I think we went into Iraq for security reasons that turned out to be absolutely mistaken.
But we stayed.
Yeah, and we stayed. And why did we stay? Well, I think we were naive. I think we thought that it would be possible to bring, quote, shock democracy, a term that I heard around town at the time, to Iraq. That this would be, you get rid of the dictator, you impose a constitutional structure, yes, from outside, and then the Iraqis take it for themselves. This didn't work. But I don't think the impulse behind it was either imperialist or vile. It was the thought that perhaps we could do something that would make life better for Iraqis. The alternative, I suppose, if you're responding to a very serious security problem, is to go in, take out Saddam Hussein, I don't know, a couple rungs of Ba'athist senior generals, and then give the keys to the third guy down and say, okay, here's the place, go do with it what you want. We won't interfere in your internal affairs, so whatever repression you care to impose on your people is fine with us. And you know what we're going to do to you if we catch you pursuing WMD. I mean, it's not where we were in 2003, and I don't think it's where we are now. And I think we do, we should make an effort in circumstances. That's not to say that we're going to go out and look for countries whose leadership we should overthrow in order to attempt to impose democracy where obviously the soil of civil society has been systematically destroyed by a brutal dictatorship. That's not the plan, but that's also not really the choice.
I've been thinking today of my great-grandfather who was young and stupid and brave and booked a voyage over to France 100 years ago to drive ambulances behind the lines, and went back over to France 25 years later and fought his way up the boot of Italy. I don't know why he did either of those things. He didn't live for me to ask him. But there is this dual tradition within the United States of doing the right thing and trying to do the right thing and ending up doing a rather terrible thing. It's possible to have a posture toward the American role in the world which is primarily critical because there's probably no foreign intervention we've ever made that hasn't had deleterious consequences. We have been running an applied experiment the last 2 years in what the abdication of American moral leadership looks like. It has not been a pretty one for my colleagues in the press corps around the world, most recently Jamal Khashoggi. There is some role for the United States within the world as the articulator of ideals that, if not universal, are at least the ones that most Americans believe in, and people who support democracy and civil society around the world look to America to defend, because it turns out that in the absence of America standing up and forcefully defending those ideals, in the absence of it calling to account those nations which violate them, ugly things happen. So that's a complicated thought in that America often intervenes and does ill in the world. It sometimes intervenes and does good in the world. But when it slinks off the world stage, when it pursues its narrow self-interest with no greater conception of what the nation stands for, what it has to offer to the world, it leaves behind a vacuum. And I think we are presently dealing with such a vacuum. And the consequences of that are also possible to critique. So without defending America's recent actions, I think one can nevertheless look at that and say that there may be something to shoot for in the middle here, avoiding some of our more imperial ambitions and missteps, while at the same time not abdicating our responsibility to stand up for our ideals.
Just before we go on, just let's look at one situation. Let's look at Iran. We are now saying to Iran, we want them to change their behavior on nuclear weapons. We want them to change their behavior in terms of supporting terrorists and intervening in other countries. But we also say we want a regime change. We also want democracy. That means we're saying to those we want to negotiate with about changing their behavior that they have to go, we want to replace them. So are we not shooting ourselves in the foot? by insisting on democracy, which is not really coming in Persia, and meanwhile delaying the opportunity to settle the other issues. In Syria, for the first 4 years of the war, we said we will not negotiate unless as a precondition Assad will leave. Now, usually asking the other side to leave doesn't make for very good negotiation starters.
I lack the wisdom to solve the Middle East's myriad conflicts. I'm not going to try right now on the stage. What I'll say is, yeah, you know, we're hypocritical. We regularly ally ourselves with terrible and brutal and repressive regimes because we think that the alternative is allowing some other brutal and repressive regime within a region to do things that we find either inimical to our own interests or to be even more catastrophic. We strike deals with regimes at the same time that we're pressuring them to change. We tell foreign leaders that we hope one day that they and their system of government disappear. At the same time, we sell them weapons. We do this stuff. This is what the United States has always been. And then, to me, the question becomes, what is the alternative, right? One alternative is a kind of a Pollyannish worldview in which you go around wishing that every other government in the world was a liberal democracy with a robust civil society. And the other is to descend into a kind of a brutal realpolitik in which you no longer press these societies to change or to bend toward justice over time. And hypocrisy may be the least bad option among those three.
Maybe you should take the medical oath. At least do no harm.
You know, here listening to this conversation, I'm reminded of the Thucydides thing, which you know, the strong, you know, exert as they can, and the weak comply, right? And so the question, you know, I didn't take Todd's seminar, but a deep dive in the history of Bretton Woods provided the lesson, which is that, you know, for those of you who don't know, you know, after the Second World War, the United States basically propped up the world economy by guaranteeing the price of gold at $35 an ounce, and you know, for 30 years or so, countries around the world could come to America to get dollars for their gold. And what it did was it stabilized the world market, it stabilized the world economic system, but it also put the dollar at the center of the world economy because it provided the US dollar became the framework for anybody doing anything anywhere, which had distinct, clear, realpolitik advantages, and which also allowed, because that dollar, you know, when you ask your mom for money, it always comes with strings. So it's the same thing. People are asking the United States for money because they need dollars. It comes with strings. I don't know that the conversation about moral goodness is a particularly, and I mean this respectfully, I don't think it's a particularly nuanced, or I don't think that there's any real reality to that question. I don't think we do things because we're actually better. I think we may think we're better, but we don't do things unless there's a reason for us to do them. And so perhaps that's hypocrisy, or perhaps that's, you know, cognitive bias, right? Daniel Kahneman, basically we're just looking at things and reaffirming our own biases. So I don't know how that's a response to your question, other than that's what comes to mind.
I'll turn to the audience in 1 minute, but I'd like you to clarify your transnationalism. So when we think about that, you see, academics live on splitting concepts. So some of us, when we talk about transnationalism, we talk about, like you, about cross-national agreements, like the climate, like the Paris Accords, which is many nations coming together and making an agreement, but still these are nations who are the citizens. But some other people talk about like a United Nations government, where decisions are made on a much higher level, and there's some of them use the term supranational. That's what Europeans try to do, is turning ever more power to Brussels. And so part of the populism, some of us feel, is a result of this supranationalism. So if you could take another minute and clarify this transnationalism you love so much, which flavor do you like?
Yeah, I don't love it. I think the forces of locality are asserting themselves justifiably, and I think, unfortunately, we are not prepared ideologically or philosophically or policy-wise to deal with the reassertion of the local, and we will suffer that consequence. So I'm not in love with the transnational. I stand with Donald Trump on that, unfortunately. I think that the question of what is the transnational, I mean, we can have parse definitions, and I think I'm just using it as a way to open up the possibility for talking about the fact that what's facing the world, as Caroline said, is not going to be solved by an individual nation, and that itinerant capital is really at the root of so many of the decision-making modalities that are at work in the world today, whether on a policy front or on a behavioral front amongst the wide array of the populace. That is, that their neurological function is being transformed by the devices that we're using. Though that neurological function is being transformed in accordance with algorithms whose sole goal is economic optimization. That's what's happening to the social body. So the competing values, whatever we believe the Constitution stands for, is being eradicated by the mindless, distracted clatter that we are receiving through our cell phones. And that's a logarithmic process that is taking place before our very eyes. That's transnational because it's happening everywhere. And yes, do we want to blame Apple, or do we want to blame Google, or do we want to blame SAP? I don't know. I'm not, admittedly, yes, a critical stance. No. I mean, I'm reaffirming what you said.
I want you to come to my class. They got a lot to learn from you.
It is a critical stance that I'm taking, but I do believe that without meaningful critique, and mordant critique that has bite, it's impossible to really understand what the policy options ultimately can be. So I think they do work together.
Thank you for that. So if you could use this microphone rather than that one, any of you who want to make comments, ask questions, would you please?
I love what you had said about your initial remarks, as dystopian as they... Hello? Hello? I loved your remarks. As dystopian as they are, I think they're right on. And the problem with greatness is it can be a psychosis. And greatness in the Reagan era and before, I don't remember what great figures have used that. Was it Hitler has been quoted as saying that in early years? I don't remember. That if you're not with greatness, you are insulting the country. You're not a patriot. And that's very dangerous. I want to think of one example. I work in the space program. John F. Kennedy, I thought greatness was the Apollo program. There's been a 40-year effort to destroy government on the right so that we are unable to do great things. And I remember that you can say bad things about and good things about the space program. John F. Kennedy invited the Russians to cooperate on the space program. So he understood what greatness truly was in that sense.
Please, any of you see greatness in the space program?
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, it was a tremendous challenge. It was a challenge that I think actually did inspire an entire generation of people. And I don't think that was the end of greatness. And I don't think that the locus of opposition to greatness is really on one or the other side of the political spectrum. One of the reasons I was thinking about, I was thinking a little bit about the U.S. military, which has its ups and downs in terms of how and when and where you should deploy it. But it is certainly an important instrument for our security. And that, too, I think, is an element of the greatness.
I just wanted to pick up on the comment that was just made, which I think is very interesting. And I certainly also believe that the space program was a great accomplishment, aspirational and amazing, just visually stirring, I think, for Americans and people around the world to think that that could be accomplished by human beings. But I think your broader point is one I think it is a very important to reiterate, which is that I find it very unfortunate how the process of governing, of government itself, has been diminished and denigrated to such an extent. The idea that public service of a variety of kinds is no longer has the kind of positive association that I think was true in past generations. That being a politician is such a negative thing, that being a public servant is being a bureaucrat, is being being part of the swamp, etc. I do think that there is a real need to kind of reclaim. You can differ about policy, you can differ about the size of government or whether a department should exist or not, but the whole idea of denigrating and tearing down these institutions that are flawed, certainly, and have flawed people in them, but we need them. And for us to ever try and live up to our ideals, even the effort, will require us to believe in the system that we have, which includes our system of government and the people who work there.
Thank you. Is this on? There. Yeah. I found this, a lot of the comments very depressing. And if we go back 120 years, the single biggest problem that people were discussing in American cities was horse manure. And what are we going to do with the horse manure problem that created not just stench but disease? And out of nowhere came the solution, which was electric vehicles. If you go back to the 1970s, the big problem was the population bomb, and in fact, people were concerned about global cooling in the 1970s. And yet, we have some countries have the opposite demographic problem now, and we have the problem of global warming. Ayad, in your comments, you mentioned the aquifers drying up, which you said, of course, seems to me an enormously serious problem, but you mentioned it was one of a litany that you will not go into. I'm sure every person could come up with a different problem that's facing the world right now. But when I look at the world, and I think we're being very provincial to look at the United States' moment right now of national, hyper-chauvinistic ethnic nationalism and polarized politics and dysfunction, all those things. But when I look at the world, I see a world where life expectancy is in general up, maternal and infant mortality is at its lowest rates, world poverty defined in a more objective way is declining, largely through the incredible economic development in Asia, and we have, I share all your concerns about these technologies in our pocket and what this so-called matrix is doing to our minds. But I see a lot of evidence of things getting better. Violence is at its lowest. If you look at number of humans killed by other humans per year, it's generally going down. So I want to push you to tell me an optimistic story, and something that's better that, and also Yoni, that that was depressing. You said the best we can do is hypocrisy. So I would like to just kind of provoke at least you two, but everyone, to put what makes you happy or optimistic when you think about greatness, not American greatness necessarily, but in the world today.
Well, I'm heartened by the generous nature of your address to us. I felt something that makes me hopeful and happy. I'm also a believer. I follow Emerson in believing, and I will quote Emerson now, but saying great nations, great men, and of course it was specific to his time, are perceivers of the terror of life and arm themselves against it. I don't think that the wholesale sale of hope for the sake of monetizing the adhesive attention that these devices try to foster in us, and the curation of our pleasure principle, and the needing of us to constantly be hopeful about things, does not sit particularly well with American anti-intellectualism. I will quote Emerson again by saying, "Why can't a man sit down to think in this country without somebody asking if he's got a headache?" It's a particularly nefarious combination. I don't think this is a time for us to be hopeful. I think it's a time for us to look very deeply in the mirror and to see what the problems are and to address them. But I am hopeful that we can have that conversation, I suppose.
Yoni, you were called upon.
So one way to think about hypocrisy is that it's the talent for holding two contradictory thoughts in your head at the same time. And I tend to think that that is actually a strength and not a weakness, that where you get sort of unipolar thinking and the inability to perceive complexity or contrasting imperatives, you end up getting in a lot of trouble pretty quickly. The narrative you've sketched is of a century often referred to as the American century, in which the fruits of American science have gone around the globe, not exclusively, but in things like the Green Revolution and elsewhere were preponderantly American research, where you had sort of Pax Americana, the Cold War, and marked by its exceptions, but which created a degree of stability. It is precisely because one can perceive the long upward arc of the latter half of the 20th century, and precisely because of how exceptional that is in the broad sweep of human history, that I am both hopeful for all of the signs of renewal I see at the local level in this country, elsewhere, the progress I can perceive, and fearful for it, because it proceeded for the last half century within an anomalous framework, one that does not actually line up with other periods of the recent human past. And I can see that its foundations are cracking. And so it's both, I think, a cause for optimism. America, however flawed and however blundering, managed to preside over a period of remarkable world and global peace and prosperity. And if we did it before, presumably, it is possible to work in a multilateral fashion and again assume the mantle of global leadership and extend it. But if we choose not to do that, I have no reason particularly to think that the progress will continue of its own momentum.
Yeah, I wondered if you could comment on the idea, looking at Switzerland, for example. That's a small country that's purposely kind of disengaged, maybe, from world politics. Or not from world politics, it's a venue to do things, but it doesn't really have a foreign policy. Its foreign policy is disinterest. Norway is a country...
No, it's foreign policy's interest.
Well, oh, very good. Yeah. You're welcome. Is there anyone else I can set up? Sorry. So you look at Norway, it seems to be aspirational in the world stage to do good, to actually do something positive. So one wants to be engaged, one wants to be disengaged. They're both small. Can either of them be great compared to the United States? Maybe consider that in the context of the Paris Climate Accord.
Well, anyway, do we want to rise to the...
I think there are a lot of things about Switzerland that are great. One of them is the ICRC, the International Committee on the Red Cross. Let me tell you something about the International Committee on the Red Cross. If you are a combatant and the ICRC knows that you're up to something, is it going to call you out to others in the international community? No. It's not going to do that because that's not its mission. Its mission is to visit prisoners and to see if they're getting the kind of treatment they deserve, et cetera. So again, this is a case of, can you have a set of only good things, or do you have to take something else along with them? So in that respect, in its ability, I think, to hold a neutral standard and get players in conflict, armed conflict, to agree that that is a neutral standard and they're not favoring one side over another, that is a remarkable thing and a great thing. Norway punches way above its weight in terms of the advance of a a normative agenda of the kind that we've been talking about here. It's not. It doesn't do so uniquely. I mean, I think there are a lot of countries that have been quite proactive, including other small countries on my issues. For example, the Netherlands, Denmark, on conflict prevention, atrocity prevention, have been, stellar. I mean, at the forefront. I mean, these are species, I suppose, of greatness. But it is also true of Switzerland that they basically sat out the 20th century and let the interest compound. And that turns out to be very good business if your other choices are to be some other European country during the 20th century. And Norway is blessed by extraordinary natural resources of a kind that, when burned, lead to other problems. So, I mean, I guess what I want to say is that we live in a world of mixed bags. And I think, without getting all economist David Ricardo on you, if we could each stick to the things at which most others would agree that were pretty good, we might actually make some progress.
I just add one line as a Jewish child born in Germany. Switzerland and Norway didn't stop Hitler.
Thank you, panel, for a very interesting discussion. Excuse me, I have a cold. I'm in thinking about this word great. I think that what I have found trouble personally, and perhaps many of the others in the room have now, is that great America's greatness now, if we can talk about that as something we all would like to see, seems to be associated only with winning. And that to be great, you simply have to win, which means something else has to lose. Others have to lose. Perhaps even the rest of the world, as it would appear our current leader would like to see. I'm wondering, Caroline, you talked about greatness as related to doing great things and having some aspirations to do some great things. And by that, I don't mean things that require us to win over someone or some other entity, but to do something remarkable that we can all admire. Scientists do great things. Sometimes those great things are bad. The atomic bomb wasn't always a great thing. We used to measure, I think, our greatness by singing some of our national anthems and other American songs that talked about America, not the great. We talked about America the good. And I'm wondering if what we have lost here is this sense of what it is to be good. One of the things I've really admired about Washington, D.C. in the last few months as I'm writing the Metro is that the Metro is trying to be good. I thought that was a wonderful slogan. They're not saying we're going to win, that we're going to somehow bowl you over with our greatness. We're just going to try to do what we think we need to do to serve you, which is to be good. So I'm wondering, how can we translate that conversation that we have in our country right now from one of where we are insisting that greatness equals winning to somehow move it to the notion that greatness means doing good and remarkable things?
I'm going to graft a little extra on that question and see one more time if I get enlightenment here. And that is, what if we argue that we should promote democracy overseas only with non-lethal means? So diplomacy, through education, through exchange, through travel, but never by sending in tanks and missiles. Because if you look at the record, whenever we used armed forces to promote democracy, a lot of people got killed, at least 600,000 in Iraq, and many more wounded, and we're still very far from a democracy. So what if we try to do good without using force?
Well, I think that's much preferable. I'd have to say a comment on something Todd had raised earlier about Iraq, in terms of trying to go in and sort of impose a democratic structure on a civil society that's not prepared. And I think we've certainly seen some evidence in Eastern Europe of the places where it's been easier or harder, what kind of the pre-conditions of having a democracy are. And I think in those circumstances where we have actually used the moral suasion and other types of mechanisms to advance a vision of democracy, to support through diplomacy, through education, through actual financial support for civil society in a whole variety of ways. I think we can look at the Baltics, and you look at Slovenia, and you look at other places where there has actually been, post end of the Soviet Union and its satellites, a real taking hold of democracy. And I think that is, we can't claim that, but we could certainly say that we assisted in it. And I guess to go back to the original question, which I thought was just absolutely right on, when I think of the preamble of the Constitution, which I think it should be read more often by people because it's really a beautiful part of the document that lays out this aspirational vision, not in competition, not as a winning strategy over other nations, but really as a way of perfecting or attempting, believing that trying to be better is the goal of the society, is the goal of the government, to try and ensure that we have a system where we can become better. Not that we're there already, that we're the best. And I think that the whole slogan of America is great, or Make America Great Again, which brings up so many negative associations in the association of those phrases with despots in the past. I think it is just one to avoid. Make America better? That seems a better slogan to me.
Todd, are you going to, anybody else wants to join?
It's a great question, and part of the paucity of the imagination of the present administration probably is its inclination to conceive of these things in zero-sum terms, where there is always a winner and always a loser. Bretton Woods may be a better example of America has often acted in its own self-interest, but done so in a way calibrated to elevate others in the process. And if you want to model a sustainable model, that's not a bad one. America has also sometimes been great in acting in self-restraint, in not pursuing the full advantage. We don't press for full reparations from Germany after World War II as we did after World War I, so as not to create a second Weimar. Right? So there are moments where American greatness is in what we don't do as much as in what we do. But, and this is the tricky part, to advance our ideals solely through moral suasion and force of example is sometimes to countenance profound injustice. This country spent 70 years with the North trying to persuade the South through the force of moral suasion that slavery was an unrelieved evil, and ended up with a war that killed 750,000, and yet I cannot conceive of that war as a tragedy. It was necessary, and to have asked those held in human bondage to have waited another few generations until the rest of America got its act together would have been profoundly wrong. And so there are moments, but the horror of war ought to teach us all a little bit of humility and to think very hard before applying American military force at home or abroad in the pursuit of justice, because the cost is always so high. But that's not to say that it's not a price that's ever worth paying.
You want to go next?
Okay, I guess the thing that strikes me is that the profundity of how much we disagree, how much human beings disagree. I mean, we may disagree about what it means to make America great, but I'm not sure we're going to get any closer if we say we'll make it better, because then what would make it better? Because people disagree about what makes it better. People disagree about what justice is, about what good is, about what right is, truth. There are no non-question begging criteria for deciding these things. What we have is people disagreeing with each other, and I don't see anything particularly wrong about that unless and until we stop talking with each other, unless and until we grow so intolerant that we cannot stand the mere fact that people might disagree with us. And I think that that's the problem that we face today. And if there was one thing that we could do to make America great again, it might be to try to keep talking with each other, try to keep thinking, well, maybe I don't have the monopoly on the truth or what's good or what's right. Maybe I could learn from you simply because you disagree with me. And maybe we could talk with each other without trying to cut each other's heads off. This, I think, is from time immemorial. It's biblical. We're not going to solve these problems, but we might be able to manage them in such a way that we can live together peacefully. So that's what I would want.
Can I just have a quick comment? I mean, I don't disagree with you at all, but I think maybe I just see the framing differently from you, because I think that the idea of saying America is great doesn't allow for dialogue. Yeah. It means that we are already there, and I know what it is, and any viewpoint you have is wrong. It's sort of America, love it or leave it. And so I absolutely think what you've said is profound, is that we have to be able to keep talking to each other. We're always going to disagree. But the question is, have I already decided from the beginning that I know what's right and I'm always going to be right? There's not even really a point in having a dialogue.
I don't think that there's a point in having a discussion unless you think that you might be mistaken. What's the point of it otherwise? But because you think you might be mistaken doesn't mean that you can't have a belief. I have a belief, but I may be mistaken about it.
So let me first say that's why we're here. That's why we created that series, very much in spirit of what you said. But I like to return to my colleague earlier about some good news. So we just did a major study of what we call moral dialogues. And we pointed out that something odd is happening, that nations can have a conversation about moral issues, which are not idle and not just ships passing each other at night. It's kind of odd at the beginning because you think you can imagine a family around a dinner table having a conversation. Well, these days, even those are not easy. But to think about a nation of 300 plus people having a conversation, it seems at first odd. But when we looked at it, here what we see. So if you go, let's say, to 1950, there basically was no concept of any moral obligation to Mother Earth. There was just not something people talked about. People would throw things out of the window or into the rivers. It was not an issue, and then it was triggered, like as often as by a brief or book, by Silent Spring, and we started a billion-hour conversation. It is not over. We still disagree at the margin, but by now most people agree that we have some kind of moral obligation, some kind of stewardship toward Earth. The civil rights movement, the women's rights movement, were all examples where people came and had a very painful conversation, which is far from over, we're far where we should be, but I think most reasonable people will agree that there have been thousands of black mayors, of black sheriffs in the South, and so on. We made some kind of progress. The same in the relationship between genders. But maybe the most interesting examples is that of same-sex marriages. It took 19 years between the day President Clinton signed a bill of the Defense of Marriage Act, which defined marriages between a man and a woman. And 19 years later, the Roberts Court declared same-sex marriage as legal. So over 19 years, we can track how public dialogues led to the change of a moral consensus, what is right. And so I think at the moment we have, in effect, a profound moral consensus about what is the proper role of the presidency, about nationalism. But I think when the dust will settle, we'll see that the way we came out of McCarthyism will come out with a new shared moral understanding. So thank you for your question.
I just want to go on with the question of greatness. And as you can hear from my accent, I'm born in Germany during the war. And So I'm carrying the German history with me. And, you know, Hitler was great, yes. I grew up in East Germany under Stalin. I was a child under Stalin. Stalin was great. So when I saw the word, what makes a great American, it really bothered me. Because like you said, greatness is not a good thing. Like you said, we have to learn to be humble. Being humble. If you think about a scientist or think about the space program, you know, these are not people who say, I'm great. These are people who believe that they can do things. And to do that, you need humbleness, certain amount of it. And so the word great really, really bothered me. And so I just, you know, when I hear it from time, it really hurts. And so I just was a little bit perturbed.
Let me first apologize to you. This is completely my fault of using that term. We kind of have that tension between flagging an issue and using some terms which people recognize and then using words which here and there offend. I'm certainly sensitive as having somewhat similar background to what you're saying. But in a moment we'll see if the panel wants to add something, but maybe we'll take another question.
I don't know how to put this, but I'm wondering how much we always conflate, or seem to me to conflate, you know, the Constitution and democracy with capitalism. And I think some of the biggest problems that we have in this country is this idea that, you know, each generation has to do better than the last generation, as if the last generation didn't do good enough. And maybe there's a lot of us in the room and a lot of us in the nation who did good enough, and our kids don't have to have more money and bank accounts and cell phones and what have you. And I'm wondering, with capitalism, there's the clear distinction that to be a better capitalist, you have to make more and have bettered your, bested yourself from the other. The other person has to lose a little bit, and has to be second in you're first. Whereas that's not, there's nothing in the democracy that says that, and there's nothing in the Constitution that says you have to be capitalist in the way we've designed capitalists. So that's kind of like I just like to put out there and see if you can make a question out of it.
If I can respond to that, I think that capitalism as an ideology or as a way of thinking about reality is haunted by a central contradiction, which I think you're talking about. And that central contradiction is that capital is an abstraction which is never returned, is never conceived to return to the cycle of decay. There is no fall or winter in the life of capital. There is only spring and summer. And therefore, it is at odds with the very nature of reality. Capitalism, as a quasi-religious ideology, offers a utopic, endlessly progressing and growing mythic model that is patently false. And so we, as a society, consume the world's resources, and we also build into this system a process of debt, which is the only way to keep the illusion going. We suffer the cyclical financial meltdowns, which everyone seems to think are a problem. They're actually pointing to a solution. The problem is the success of the financial system, not the failure of it. And until we find a way, and I think that to me it speaks to, your question speaks to the deeper root of the problem, which is that we are beholden to a materialist interpretation of reality, and until we find some other way to be able to talk about what we are as a collective and as individuals, we are going to just be trying to make money.
if I could just jump in here, I think it's a great question, but and maybe on a less lofty level, more specific to our system, I actually think democracy is an important check on capitalism. And we saw in the 20th century, during the Great Depression, how Congress addressed some of the greatest problems by passing the most significant legislation on financial sort of restructuring, minimum wage laws, and allowing people to join unions, and establishing Social Security, and then in the 60s, Medicare, Medicaid, Obamacare, all of these things where our efforts through democracy to address some of the worst excesses of capitalism, and to ensure that there is a system where people have better shared opportunities. So I actually think these two systems have to work together, but capitalism unrestrained by any kind of force to ensure some more equitable transfer of wealth between people is certainly one that could lead to extreme despotism.
Didn't our friend Mike Novak suggest that these things go hand in hand, democracy and capitalism?
Yeah, and that's something that is increasingly in question, whether maybe there's an authoritarian form of capitalism which is not quite as dependent on the free flow of information, et cetera, through the market as maybe has been thought. And I don't know; the jury is still out on that question. But actually, I did want to come back to the previous question. There's this question that lingers, and it is, what is the role of the individual in history? And I think that some people have said, well, history is the history of great individuals, and what they mean by great individuals is neither morally good nor morally bad individuals. They mean powerful individuals, and you mentioned Hitler and Stalin in this context, and you're right. But I would also say Churchill and FDR. So to ask the question, is someone powerful? Is someone influential? And to ask the same question, frankly, of nations, is only to ask half the question. It gets you the formal answer: powerful, great, etc. But it doesn't give you the content. What's that individual or what's that country about? What does it stand for? And Hitler, Stalin stood for certain kinds of things that were very different from what, in my opinion, Churchill and FDR stood for. Now, Churchill had his colonialism problems, to be sure, but he was not inconsequential in the defeat of Hitler. And so I think you have to look at both aspects of this. I had very brilliantly quoted from the Athenians, the Athenian generals in the Peloponnesian War visiting the Melians, whom they're threatening. And they're saying, "You will surrender, or we will wipe you out. You will pay tribute to us." And the Melians don't want to do this. And the Athenian generals say, "Well, here's the world we live in. The strong do what they can, and the weak do what they must." And that's a point of view. That was actually the point of view of the losing side in the Peloponnesian War. So that's where I think some thought as well. I think when Churchill, the question is, did Churchill call himself great? I don't know. I mean, I think when Churchill looked in the mirror, he saw somebody pretty great looking back at him. Let's just put it that way.
Please.
I want to thank the lady who mentioned something about growing up in Germany. My mother's also from Nazi Germany, was a boat child. But I want to thank Ayad because you've opened up something, you used the word mythic, and you just mentioned the Greeks. And in talking about greatness, there's always hubris, which is the downside. But we start to enter the dimension of the soul and the tragic. So whenever you're talking about making something great, it's this American positivism which lacks a sense of the tragic. The tragic is what brings us humility It's something that ripens the soul in mankind. Now, how do you weigh a soul? You know, it's like, what is the soul of a nation? What is the sense of tragedy, of trying to ameliorate tragedy, of compassion being born out of it? And the lack of that capacity, too much hubris, the desire to build enduring things and build pyramids and build greatness without a sense. Like, I think of Lincoln in this scene during the Civil War, who was able to enunciate the sense of the tragic. That's the greatness of Lincoln. It's not just that he won the war. He could feel the amount of suffering that was in that war and create a new American vision based on that suffering. We don't have the poets with us, and I don't just mean nice rhyming poetry, that can find a soul. We're losing our soul. What is the soul of America at this point? So let's talk about greatness of soul. You look in the life of Gandhi, you say, there's a great man, he died tragically, but there's something about soul. Let's talk about soul, not necessarily religiously. We can be a little more Greek with this, but what is the essence or the depth of what we are, and how does life bring that out? A great life illuminates that, even if it's tragic.
Well, there seems to be universal agreement, so we'll take another question.
Well, I felt I couldn't leave without commenting on your basic premise, which everyone seems to agree with, that we must have a civil dialogue and that somehow that takes priority. I think under the context of the present administration, which doesn't have a clue of what real greatness is, and they are white nationalism is being bragged about, I can't deal with the 30 or 35% of people who support that kind of a concept. I will say several decades ago, I voted for the opposite political party that I support now because they valued country over party, and I think that's just not the case anymore. And in the last election a few days ago, we could have gone out and tried to do the persuasion vote, but no. We got at the vote of people who believe in what America really stands for. So maybe 10, 15 years ago, I would have agreed to this, but unfortunately, I think we're past that point. I'd like to know what people
I'd like to respond to that, sir. And maybe if we can continue the dialogue for a minute.
Sure.
35% of Americans, you can argue it's 30 or 40, it's a lot of good people, a lot of human beings. So maybe they've been misled, but many of them are suffering. They lost their jobs, and we told them we're going to get them other jobs, we didn't. We told them we're going to represent them, but the representatives respond to people with their pockets rather than to the masses in the streets. They have been fear-mongered of immigration and crime. They don't have the college education, many of them, to see through the lies Fox tells them. So the question is, should we write them off and say, you are bigoted people, or we should say, everybody is redeemable, and we should especially reach out to these people because we should hear their pain and understand that their pain has misdirected them in their expression. Now, aside from the moral issue of not writing off a third of our population or more, there's a political question. They're voting. So even if you didn't expect my moral argument, writing them off turns out not to be very good politics.
I don't say write them off, but I'm still waiting for one Trump supporter to admit that they made a mistake. And why are they voting against their own interests? This is what kind of drives me crazy. These people are voting against their own interests. They're voting for people who are trying to get rid of health care, preconditions. They're going to be hurt by all of this. And I guess I just can't communicate. Maybe you can help me, but I can't deal with it.
Okay, we're getting very close to the witching hour, but I'm not going to let you go home without answering one more question. And in the process, please also address the last one. And that is, in the end, there is a budget, and we can't do everything. So, to the degree that we have to make choices, should we dedicate most of our attention resources to making this country better, to reduce inequality, to take care of healthcare, to provide education, to provide housing, to fix up our infrastructure? Or should we continue to invest heavily in promoting whatever we see our interest overseas? What makes for when we talk about, you quote it so often and so well, a perfect union, the perfect union we're talking about the American Union. So maybe I'm asking, the way we bring light to the heathens is by having more light at home rather than forcing it down their throat overseas.
Well, I mean, I think just as a factual matter, our budget devotes a lot more to, mostly to domestic. I guess the military is a very big part of our budget. So unless you're thinking of the military part of the sort of advancement of democracy, which I tend to not think of in so much as more of the State Department's diplomatic budget, which is actually tiny. The resources we devote to that are quite small. So certainly, I think we need to invest a lot more resources in making our country a better place. I think there's a lot of work to be done to make America better, which is my new slogan, Make America Better. And so, yes and yes. I think but we can't be a better country if we have rising sea levels that are going to swamp our coastlines, that our fires are burning across the country, and we're all, certainly in D.C., suffering even more in the summers. hotter summers, worse storm seasons. So I think we can't really separate these issues. I think we have to be engaged in the world. We have to resolve collectively with other nations these transnational problems that none of us can solve alone.
Last words.
Well, look, security matters, and the purpose of the U.S. military should not be to fight expeditionary wars to bring democracy around the globe. The purpose of the U.S. military should be to deter bad actors and, when necessary, to prevail over them. And I think that's important. Now, I'm not giving up on the normative agenda just because I don't think it's achievable by military means. I don't think there's a contradiction between saying that freedom is indeed the best condition for human beings and acknowledging that there are limitations to your ability to take action that causes these conditions to be enjoyed by human beings. It is not a matter of hypocrisy to aspire to a particular ideal and yet to recognize that you're likely to fall short of it. It's the difference between a kind of sense of what should be versus what is. And we should always judge what is by what should be, even though we have a lot of disagreement over what should be. Because if we don't, then we're merely being complacent and self-satisfied. And that's no place to be.
So in the post-war era, America worked in concert with other nations to establish a framework. And that framework was imperfect, but it was a framework based on fundamental human rights, a framework which attempted to, in some small way, suppress the flames of religious and racial bigotry, one which tried to rein in some of the excesses of capitalism. We tried to create a set of ground rules that would profit us by profiting the world, by making the world a more prosperous place, by making the world a more just place, in the belief that that was the kind of world in which the United States would thrive, and it was also the kind of world that the citizens of the rest of the world deserve to live in. If that is our moral vision, then I think that there is a path to greatness, not as sort of a zero-sum contest, but as America claiming a role within a world of actors in which all of them gain greater freedom and liberty to act as they would by our assistance in establishing a fundamental fairness. To the extent we abdicate that responsibility, to the extent that we don't restrain powerful forces that act in transnational ways, to the extent that we don't address ourselves to problems that are too large for any individual state or people to tackle on their own, then we are eroding that foundation. And we are going to be left in a world in which America can thump its chest very loudly, but will be merrily demonstrating its own impotence. And so that is a sort of a fundamental challenge. But again, it's one that resolves the tension that you have expressed, Amitai, by suggesting that fundamentally, if America acts in this way, everyone can gain, and that is something which is worth pursuing, however imperfectly.
I don't have anything to offer, but it's a great question. I don't know what the response would be.
Well, you enriched us earlier. So
maybe, yeah.
In December, we're going to go dark to let you celebrate your holidays. These are being perturbed by such conversations. But we'll get together again, and I hope you all join us on January 14. It's going to be a Monday, in which we're going to ask the question, must we be tribal? The role of community in our personal and collective life. And be a special treat for me, because I'm going to leave this chair and let somebody, a wiser, moderate, and I'm going to sit over there and really be able to participate in the conversation. So please help me thank this wonderful, complicated discussion. Thank you very much. Thank you very much.